In 1899, a photograph was taken inside a nursery at the Blackwood Orphanage in New York City. For over a century, it sat forgotten in a dusty archive box. When historian Ruth Cartwright finally restored the image using modern technology, what appeared behind one of the cribs made her blood run cold. A figure stood there, pale and motionless, watching the sleeping children. But according to the orphanage records, that child had been dead and buried 3 months before the photograph was taken. Ruth Cartwright had spent 15 years studying Victorian-era photographs, but nothing had prepared her for what she was about to discover. She specialized in restoring damaged historical images, bringing clarity to faded faces and forgotten moments. When she acquired a collection of documents and photographs from the defunct Blackwood Orphanage, she thought it would be another routine project. The orphanage had operated in Lower Manhattan from 1890 to 1902, housing dozens of abandoned and orphaned children during some of the city's darkest years. Ruth expected to find the usual portraits of stern matrons and sad-eyed children, perhaps some group photos taken on holidays. What she found instead would haunt her for the rest of her life. The photograph arrived in a sealed envelope, badly water-damaged and covered in mold. It showed a large nursery room with 6 wooden cribs lined against a wall. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, creating long shadows across the worn floorboards. 5 of the cribs held sleeping infants, their tiny faces barely visible beneath threadbare blankets. At first glance, the image seemed unremarkable, just another snapshot of institutional life in the late 19th century. Ruth carefully scanned the photograph at high resolution, planning to remove the damage and enhance the faded details. She worked methodically, using specialized software to peel away layers of deterioration. As the image cleared, she noticed something strange in the background, just behind the 3rd crib from the left. At first, Ruth thought it was a shadow, or perhaps a trick of the light, but as she increased the contrast and sharpened the details, a shape began to emerge. It was definitely a figure, standing perfectly still in the dim corner of the nursery. Ruth leaned closer to her computer screen, her heart beginning to race. The figure was a child, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, dressed in a simple white nightgown. But something about the proportions seemed wrong. The neck was too long, stretching upward in an unnatural way. The face was pale, almost luminous against the dark background, but it had no discernible features. Where the eyes should have been, there were only large, empty voids that seemed to absorb the light around them. The mouth was a thin, dark line, neither smiling nor frowning, just existing in a state of eternal stillness. Ruth saved the enhanced image and sat back in her chair, trying to steady her breathing. She told herself it was probably just a photography defect, a double exposure or some chemical reaction on the old film. But she could not shake the feeling that she was looking at something genuinely disturbing. She decided to investigate further, pulling out the orphanage ledgers and death records that had come with the photograph collection. The records were meticulously kept, listing every child who entered the orphanage, their age, their condition, and eventually their fate. Ruth cross-referenced the photograph's date, clearly marked on the back as October 15, 1899, with the ledgers from that year. What she discovered made her hands tremble as she turned the pages. In July of 1899, 3 months before the photograph was taken, a child named Catherine Mills had died at the orphanage. The death certificate listed the cause as scarlet fever, a common killer of children in that era. Catherine had been 8 years old with pale blonde hair and blue eyes. She had arrived at Blackwood in 1897 after her parents died in a tenement fire. According to the records, she was buried in Potter's Field, the common grave for the city's poor and forgotten. But as Ruth compared the description of Catherine with the figure in the photograph, a terrible suspicion began to form in her mind. She examined the photograph again, zooming in on the ghostly figure behind the crib. Despite the lack of clear features, she could make out wispy blonde hair hanging limply around the elongated face. The height and build seemed consistent with an 8-year-old girl. Ruth felt a chill run down her spine. Could this really be Catherine Mills, appearing in a photograph taken 3 months after her supposed death? She tried to rationalize it. Perhaps the records were wrong? Perhaps Catherine had not actually died in July. Perhaps someone had made a clerical error, marking the wrong child as deceased. But as Ruth dug deeper into the orphanage records, she found something far more disturbing than a simple mistake. Between 1890 and 1902, Blackwood Orphanage recorded 47 deaths among its residents. This was not unusual for the time period. Disease, malnutrition, and accidents claimed many young lives in institutional settings. But as Ruth examined the death certificates more closely, she noticed a pattern that made her stomach turn. Every 6 months, like clockwork, there would be a cluster of deaths, usually 3 or 4 children within a span of 2 weeks. The causes varied: scarlet fever, diphtheria, accidental falls, sudden heart failure. But the timing was too consistent to be coincidental. Ruth created a spreadsheet, plotting each death on a timeline. The pattern was undeniable. Something was happening at Blackwood Orphanage every 6 months, something that was killing children in a systematic way. Ruth reached out to a colleague, Callie Brennan, who specialized in medical history. Callie reviewed the death certificates and agreed that the pattern was suspicious. She pointed out that some of the recorded symptoms did not match the listed causes of death. For example, one child supposedly died of diphtheria but showed no signs of the characteristic membrane in the throat. Another child's heart failure was attributed to a congenital defect, yet the admission records showed no mention of any heart problems when the child first arrived at the orphanage. It was as if someone had been fabricating causes of death to cover up the true nature of what was happening at Blackwood. Determined to uncover the truth, Ruth traveled to New York City to search for additional records. She visited the city archives, the Historical Society, and even the locations where the orphanage once stood. The building itself had been demolished in 1920, replaced by a warehouse that later burned down. But Ruth managed to locate the personal papers of Victor Ashford, who had served as the orphanage director from 1895 to 1902. These papers were held by Ashford's great-grandson, who agreed to let Ruth examine them in his home. The papers filled 3 large boxes and included correspondence, financial records, and a personal journal that Ashford had kept during his tenure at Blackwood. Ruth spent an entire weekend going through the documents, taking careful notes and photographing pages of interest. What she found in Ashford's journal made her question everything she thought she knew about the case. The journal entries were cryptic, filled with references to meetings, rituals, and obligations that Ashford seemed desperate to fulfill. He wrote about the children not as individuals to be cared for, but as resources to be managed and allocated. One entry from March 1898 read, "The order requires 3 more by the equinox. I have selected the weakest. No one will question their departure." Ruth felt sick as she read page after page of similar entries. Ashford was not running an orphanage. He was running a collection center, gathering vulnerable children for some unknown purpose. The journal made reference to a group called the Collective, an organization that seemed to have significant influence over Ashford's decisions. He wrote about receiving instructions from them, about delivering children to specific locations at specific times, and about the consequences of failure. In one particularly chilling entry from September 1899, just a month before the nursery photograph was taken, Ashford wrote, "Catherine Mills resisted the preparation. Her transformation was incomplete. She walks the halls at night, and the infants can sense her presence. I must find a way to complete the process before the next gathering." Ruth sat in stunned silence, the journal trembling in her hands. This confirmed her worst fear. Catherine Mills had not simply died, she had been subjected to some kind of procedure, some horrific process that Ashford called a transformation. And somehow, she had survived it, at least partially, existing in some state between life and death. The figure, In the photograph was not a ghost or a double exposure. It was Catherine Mills herself, changed into something no longer fully human, standing watch over the infants who would soon face the same fate. Ruth continued reading, desperate to understand what the collective was and what they wanted with these children. Ashford's later entries became increasingly frantic. He wrote about losing control of the situation, about children who had undergone the transformation wandering the orphanage freely, visible to staff and visitors. He worried that the collective would punish him for his failures, that he would share the fate of the children if he could not restore order. The final entry in the journal was dated November 1902. "They are coming for me tonight. I have failed them for the last time. May God forgive me for what I have done to these innocents." Ruth learned that Ashford had disappeared in November 1902. The same month, the orphanage was permanently closed. No body was ever found. The official explanation was that he had fled the city to escape debts, but Ruth now suspected a darker truth. The collective had taken him, just as they had taken so many children. But who were they? What was their purpose? Ruth spent months trying to answer these questions, following every lead she could find. She discovered references to the collective in other historical documents, always connected to institutions that housed vulnerable populations. Orphanages, asylums, workhouses. They seemed to operate in the shadows of society, exploiting those who had no one to protect them. But she could never find concrete evidence of their existence. No membership lists, no organizational documents, nothing that would prove they were real. It was as if they existed in the gaps of history, carefully erasing their tracks as they moved through time. Ruth decided to present her findings at a conference on institutional abuse in historical contexts. She prepared a detailed presentation, including the restored photograph, the orphanage records, and excerpts from Ashford's journal. She was scheduled to speak on a Thursday afternoon in front of over 200 academics and researchers. But when she arrived at the conference, she found that her presentation had been removed from the schedule. The organizers claimed they had never received her proposal, that there must have been some administrative error. Ruth showed them her confirmation emails, but they insisted the emails must have been fake, that their system showed no record of her submission. Frustrated but undeterred, Ruth tried to publish her research in academic journals. She submitted articles to 6 different publications, each time including all her evidence and documentation. Every single submission was rejected, usually with vague explanations about insufficient evidence or lack of peer review. One editor told her privately that the subject matter was too controversial, that publishing it would damage the journal's reputation. Another editor simply stopped responding to her emails after the initial submission. Ruth shared her research with colleagues, hoping they would help her investigate further, or at least validate what she had found. But their reactions were strange. Some claimed they could not see the figure in the photograph, even when Ruth pointed directly at it. Others dismissed the journal entries as fiction, suggesting that Ashford had been mentally ill and his writings were delusional. A few colleagues became hostile, accusing Ruth of fabricating evidence to advance her career. One by one, they distanced themselves from her, refusing to discuss the case or acknowledge her findings. Desperate, Ruth contacted journalists, thinking that the media might be interested in such a disturbing historical mystery. Several reporters agreed to meet with her, listened to her story, and examined her evidence. They seemed genuinely intrigued and promised to investigate further. But weeks would pass without any follow-up, and when Ruth tried to contact them again, they would not return her calls. One reporter finally told her that his editor had killed the story, saying it was too speculative and potentially libelous. When Ruth asked who might be libeled by a story about events from over a century ago, the reporter had no answer. The most disturbing incident occurred when Ruth tried to access the orphanage records again. She returned to the archive where she had originally found the documents, only to be told that no such collection existed. The archivist, a different person from the one she had worked with months earlier, insisted that they had never held any materials from Blackwood Orphanage. Ruth showed them her research notes, her photographs of the documents, even her signed checkout slips from her previous visits. The archivist examined these materials with a puzzled expression and suggested that Ruth might be confused, that perhaps she had visited a different archive. When Ruth insisted she was certain, the archivist became uncomfortable and asked her to leave. Ruth went to Victor Ashford's great-grandson, hoping to at least confirm that the journal was real, that she had not imagined everything. But when she arrived at his address, she found the house empty, with a for-sale sign in the yard. Neighbors told her the family had moved away suddenly about a month earlier, leaving no forwarding address. Ruth felt panic rising in her chest. It was as if history itself was being rewritten around her, erasing all evidence of what she had discovered. She tried one last approach. Ruth contacted Maddox Green, a documentary filmmaker known for investigating historical mysteries and conspiracies. Maddox was intrigued by her story and agreed to meet with her. They spent several hours going over the evidence, with Ruth showing him everything she had collected. Maddox seemed convinced and wanted to make a film about the case. He began conducting his own research, interviewing historians and visiting locations connected to the orphanage. But after 3 weeks, Maddox called Ruth and told her he was abandoning the project. He sounded shaken, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. He would not explain what had changed his mind, only saying that some stories were better left buried. Ruth realized she was completely alone in her investigation. No one would help her, no one would believe her, and all physical evidence was disappearing. She made copies of everything she had, storing them in multiple locations, including cloud servers and physical safe deposit boxes. She wrote detailed accounts of her research and her attempts to share it, creating a record that could not be easily erased. But she knew that ultimately she was fighting a losing battle. The collective, or whatever they were called now, had too much power, too much influence. They could manipulate records, intimidate witnesses, and silence anyone who came too close to the truth. One night, Ruth was working late in her home office when she heard a sound downstairs. It was a soft creaking, like footsteps on old floorboards. Her house was new, with modern flooring that did not creak. Ruth froze, her heart pounding. She listened carefully and heard the sound again, definitely footsteps, slowly climbing the stairs toward her office. She grabbed her phone, ready to call the police, but before she could dial, the footsteps stopped just outside her door. Ruth stared at the door handle, watching it slowly turn. The door opened, revealing an empty hallway. But Ruth could feel a presence there, something watching her from the darkness. She did not sleep that night. She sat in her office with all the lights on, jumping at every sound. When morning finally came, Ruth made a decision. She would stop her investigation. She would delete her research, destroy her copies, and never speak of Blackwood Orphanage again. It was the only way to stay safe. But even as she made this decision, Ruth knew that the story would not end with her silence. The collective was still out there, still operating in the shadows, and somewhere in orphanages and children's homes across the country, vulnerable children might still be disappearing, subjected to whatever horrific transformation Catherine Mills had endured. Ruth deleted her files and burned her physical notes. She told colleagues that her research had been misguided, that she had made errors in interpretation. She withdrew from academic circles, eventually leaving her position at the university. But she kept one thing: a small printed copy of the restored photograph hidden in a locked drawer. Sometimes, late at night, she would take it out and stare at the figure behind the crib, at Catherine Mills standing watch over the sleeping infants. Ruth would remember the elongated neck, the featureless face, the empty eyes that seemed to look directly through the camera and across time itself. The photograph remains, here a silent testament to horrors that official history refuses to acknowledge. Catherine Mills stands frozen in that moment from 1899, neither fully alive nor completely dead, trapped in whatever state the collective had forced upon her. And the orphanage records, the death certificates, the journal entries, all of it has been erased or hidden so thoroughly that future researchers will find nothing. The story of Blackwood Orphanage has been carefully removed from the historical record, leaving only questions and shadows. Ruth often thinks about the other children, the ones who underwent the transformation successfully, unlike Catherine. Where are they now? Do they still exist in some form, serving whatever purpose the collective intended? And what about the organization itself? Has it evolved over the decades, adapting its methods to modern times while maintaining its core mission? These questions haunt Ruth, but she knows she will never find answers. Some truths are too dangerous to pursue, protected by forces that operate beyond the reach of justice or accountability. The case of the 1899 nursery photograph stands as a reminder that history is not always an accurate record of the past. It is a narrative constructed by those with the power to shape it, and some events are deliberately excluded, hidden away where they cannot disturb the comfortable stories we tell ourselves about progress and civilization. Behind the official accounts of orphanages and charitable institutions, darker realities may exist, realities that powerful groups want to remain buried. Ruth Cartwright discovered one such reality and paid the price for her curiosity. Her career was destroyed, her credibility shattered, and her research systematically erased. But she survived, which is more than can be said for the children of Blackwood Orphanage. If you found this story disturbing, you are not alone. History is filled with moments that challenge our understanding of what humanity is capable of, both good and evil. The question we must ask ourselves is this: how many other secrets are hidden in old photographs and forgotten records, waiting for someone brave or foolish enough to bring them to light? And when those secrets are discovered, will we have the courage to confront them, or will we allow them to be buried again, preferring comfortable ignorance to uncomfortable truth? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and do not forget to subscribe for more stories that explore the dark corners of history. Some mysteries refuse to stay buried, no matter how hard we try to forget them.